How's it going, everyone? Mafari here. Welcome to Heliopolis Radio. Today, we're fortunate to be joined by John Launius. I hope I got that right. He's
You
the
did.
CEO of Shihan Wellbeing and Shihan Consultants. And so he's here to share a bit about himself, what he does, and also his business. So without further ado, thank you, John. I hand it over to you. Tell us about yourself. What is it that you love to do?
Thank you, Mufar. I appreciate that. So, when I was 9 years old, I started studying two things, martial arts and world fragrance traditions. And how this would happen was that I'm the guardian for my special needs brother. And when we were
Mhm.
young, we would get bullied because obviously stuff like that happens. I wanted to protect him. And
Mhm.
when I couldn't protect him because I didn't have the skills, my mother said, "Okay, well, you're gonna go to martial arts class." And
Mhm.
so when I got to martial arts class, all that did ultimately was get me beat up more, but that's okay.
Mhm.
It taught me a lot. Mr. Black, who was my first martial arts teacher, was burning now what I call bad incense. And, it's in America, in North America, there's a lot of synthetic incenses where if you look at the history of incense throughout the rest of the world, we know that the written history of incense is 6,000 years old. We know that the archaeological evidence of incense is 35,000 years old. And that comes from the caves in southern France. There's one particular cave called Bear Skull Cave
Mhm.
where 35,000 years ago, one of our earlier ancestors went outside, grabbed some pine needles, came back inside, took a bear skull, turned it upside down, put it on a raised rock, put the pine needles in there, and gave fire to it, and suddenly didn't touch it for 35,000 years. So we have something that remains that shows that human beings for at least 35,000 years have been using incense as some kind of a devotional tool.
Mhm.
And then, if we look at the advent of fire, if we really want to look at the origin of incense, we can see that probably right after humans figured out fire, somebody put something on there and said, "Oh, hey, I feel different." We should remember that. And so there's
Mhm.
a lot of connotations to medicine traditions and shamanism. But back to the origin story. Mr. Black was burning now what I would call bad incense, but it fascinated me. What is this? What is this thing that when you light it up creates smoke that you can see and fragrance? And so Mr. Black gave me some. I didn't tell my mom, and I went home and I was in my room and I started lighting it, and you could hear her from across the house running, to me, kicks in the door. "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And I said, I'm burning incense." And she's like, "You can't do that." I go, "Well, what do you mean you can't? I can't do that. You sent me to martial arts class." And Mrs. She said, "No, no, no." She said, "Look, you can do that. You just have to tell me so you don't burn down the house." I'm like, "Oh, okay." And so my mother was a hippie,
Mhm.
and my dad was a military man. And so if you spend any amount of time with me, I'm the perfect amalgamation between the two of
Mhm.
those. And so then when I was 13 years old, after years of study on my own, because it was just fascinating. I mean, at whatever level, a 9-year-old up to the age of 13 can study on their own, books. My mother did, though, give me a book on world religions. And
Mhm.
what that did at a very young age was open my mind to a whole world that I had no idea existed. If this is all pre-internet. And so unless you had someone tell you about the rest of the world or you had access to a book, you really didn't know about that. And
Mhm.
so if you have grown up in North America, if Christianity is the predominant religion in North America, then most people, that's kind of their only worldview. When you look at, for example, the continent of Africa, where there's 500 languages spoken,
Mhm.
and a whole bunch of other, thoughts and ideas around, what is the divine and what names do we call it. So
Mhm.
the study of incense gave me some very interesting perspective on the rest of the world and also history. And so at a very young age, I started to learn about other ways that people see the world.
Mhm.
Well, when I was 13 years old, I would auspiciously be introduced to a Japanese komoto. And what a komoto is that if you've heard of the Japanese tea ceremony and
Yes,
you've heard
yes.
and you've heard of tea masters, well, a komoto is the equivalent of a Japanese tea master, but for the Japanese incense ceremony. And so the Japanese incense ceremony, it goes back to the Muromachi period, about 700 years. but the appreciation of incense, and the way that I usually talk about this is that I say that the world traditions of incense extend back, pre-time. But in the Japanese tradition, the appreciation of incense is 1400 years old, because in 550 AD we see that Buddhism comes to Japan through the Korean Peninsula, and in Buddhism there's always, incense is synonymous with the teachings of the Buddha. And again, if you're not Buddhist, that's okay. There's an incense tradition for almost every religion that exists, but the idea that everything is fragrant in the Buddha's world. Therefore, when we listen to incense, a concept of what we call monko, listening to incense, is that we then start to treat it, if I was going to use modern terms, like an exposure therapy, because our sense of smell is our repressed sense. It is our hidden sense. And so that's the reason why that it becomes very almost physically visceral if we walk into a building and it reminds us of a smell from 20 years before. We might go, oh my gosh, hey, wow, that smell takes me back, to my childhood. And so because our sense of smell is deeply connected to our limbic system, now with the advent of neuroscience and language around the brain, we're able to really use fragrance as a way to re-experience negative emotions that may impact what we are capable of doing, in the world. And so what we look at is we look at a concept called imprints. So beyond just a person who has studied and taught about incense for over 40 years, I'm the CEO of Shihan Wellness and also Shihan Consultants. And so Shihan Consultants, which you can see up here, is the corporate side of my business. So I am a professional trainer. I work with companies for an offering that I call a forward instead of a retreat. We talk about concepts that move businesses forward and help them grow. And I've worked with some really incredible companies and really created some incredible results. Well, that's an external journey. It can look at, new skills, new ways to communicate. But then Shihan Wellness, which isn't displayed, but Shihan Wellness houses this work that I'm doing with fragrance that we're primarily talking about. So, if for example, you kind of look at the whole course of your life, is that memory is a wonderful thing. Memory tells us who we are, but it also tells us who we are. And so if you're someone who's committed to growth, someone who's committed to really looking at, okay, who am I and where am I going? Is that there's an old Chinese expression that says the path forward seems to go back. Because every time we move forward in life, right? Every time we move forward in life, we have to go back and we have to resolve the imprints or the things that we remember from the past in a positive and a negative way. So if you've been in a long 10-year relationship, whether it's a marriage or just a partner or things like that, and you break up, obviously there's going to be some hurt there. There's going to be, some unresolved pieces and parts of the relationship. Well, in order for you to move on to the next relationship powerfully and not with, I mean, the joke often is, a lot of baggage that we have, right? Is that how do we reconcile the pieces of our past so that we can then move powerfully into our next relationships? And this is true across business. This is true across, our personal relationships, our work in groups. And so if I'm circling back to this whole thing of fragrance, is that fragrance is a very powerful way to call back these memories, positive and negative, to be able to re-experience them and then separate, the emotional attachment to things. So I've kind of diatribed for a long time. I'll throw it back to you for a minute for questions or for clarifications.
Incredible. I was going to ask if you've burnt any instance now. It seems like you've tapped into literally, you answered the questions almost subconsciously as if you already knew them, and you just answered each of them one by one. But I do want to bring it back, I guess, to Komodo, and what actually drew you to it initially. And more specifically, I understand that you have more than 3 black belts in 3 different martial arts disciplines. Is
Yeah.
there an element of the Eastern philosophy or way of life that has resonated with you in terms of understanding yourself? Everyone's drawn to different ideological, I don't want to say ideological dogmas, but different practices for
Mhm.
specific reasons. So I was just going to ask, just in terms of that, what brought you to becoming a master of incense ceremony, and what drew you to martial arts in terms
Yeah.
of yourself? Yeah.
Yeah, so for me, again, the finding of martial arts was really to learn to protect myself. And I'm very grateful for that training because it's taught me a whole bunch of other things, about discipline and about being your word. And really, at the end of the day, all we have is our word. Like if I promised you that I was going to be here for this podcast on time and I didn't show up, well, you might be angry with me and never talk to me again. And
Mm,
so being our word in what we agree to is really the secret to almost everything. And
mm,
oftentimes in life, people want to put the responsibility on somebody else when ultimately it is our responsibility to be our word, to do the things that we say we're going to do, because then that assists us to be good within our own mind and body,
mm,
and then also the relationships that we have with others. If
mm,
I'm really being honest about why I was interested in learning martial arts and also eventually incense, was that as a young child, I was in love with this idea of becoming a master. And
mm,
but I didn't know what it meant. Like, when I was growing up, David Carradine was on a show called Kung Fu, right? Every week I would watch this Caucasian, in an Asian country learning. And I was like, oh, this is so fascinating, so different from the rest of the world. But I at least had a little bit of connection to the kind of training that I was doing that, just it's, pale in comparison to what is possible when you're in actually the country of origin, learning this. But still, I thought that mastery meant that you were better than everybody.
mm,
At least initially, and that you wouldn't have to necessarily, be bothered. And that is, I mean, the furthest from the truth that I've discovered. And in actuality, true mastery doesn't even seem masterful, because if I'm out in the world, saying, I'm a master, look how great I am, it first of all, it turns people off because people don't want to be a part of that, right? Or you end up, either becoming kind of cultish, where you're some kind of
mm,
magnanimous figure who attracts people. But
mm,
ultimately, true mastery is really about being at home and so clear with yourself that the external and the internal world are truly integrated. You know,
mm,
there is no difference between what I say and what I do. And so what I learned over the course of my path, on mastery, and I'm not saying that I am a master. What I'm saying when you look at the Do art. So let's just talk specifically about Japan for a moment.
mm,
Whenever you see the word do, the letters do, or the word do at the end of one of the Japanese arts, it signifies something. So some examples of those would be judo,
mm,
aikido,
mm,
chado,
mm,
kado. Anytime that you see a do at the end of those words, it signifies that this is a path, a refinement path of body, mind, and spirit. So you can refine yourself through chado, the way of tea. You can refine yourself through the way of incense, kodo. You can refine yourself through the way of martial arts, judo, aikido, a whole number of different things. But the idea that's what I think was really interesting for me because I grew up obviously in North America. And so here there is this tendency that the more you have or the more that you do somehow signifies you as better than someone else. You heard that expression, keeping up with the Joneses, right?
mm,
Well, I don't know who the Joneses are, and I don't want to keep up with them. But the idea that what if my internal journey is so deep and so clear that I'm able to bring other people back to their own center. And so there's
mm,
a couple of Japanese words, that I will use when I teach. One is called shikaku, and shikaku can mean eye of the hurricane or dead angle. It's a place in
mm,
martial arts that you protect yourself. But it's also a place where there can be great freedom, but you have to go through a process. So the
mm,
other word is tiny fu. And so if you imagine the center of the hurricane, so imagine all the chaos on the outside, right? See it from a bird's eye view. Well, most people will live their life inside of chaos. We've all met them. Some people you can't even be around. They're so chaotic, right?
Mm,
But when you begin to go on a path of mastery or a path of refinement, said a better way, is that if you're standing still in the hurricane, then you've got these winds that are traveling anywhere between 75 miles an hour to 150, depending on the strength of the hurricane. And it's not the wind necessarily, it's all the debris coming at you, right? Well, some people think that, oh, if I move faster, then I'll be able to beat the hurricane. So they start moving faster, but they find themselves, if there's a piece of debris coming at you and you're standing still, it's going to hit you at whatever speed the wind is. But
mhm,
if you're suddenly moving, trying to move faster, you might move alongside of this threat, but you're still caught in the
mm,
center of the hurricane. So what happens though if you begin to move through the chaos of the hurricane to get to the center calm? You may have heard the expression, if you find yourself in hell, keep going. Well,
mm,
it's the idea that you're continuing to move through the chaos to get to the center calm. And so when I'm working with leaders, executives, CEOs, people like that, is that when we get to the center calm, we may not be in the chaos of the hurricane anymore, but now we're in the center calm where the barometric pressure is very high. It's very high. And so once you're there, you're able to see the chaos with a little bit of distance. But
mm,
then you can start to move the hurricane, the entire hurricane from the center calm to begin to create your own path. And
mm,
so it's the idea that what if everything we do gets us to the center calm of who we are. So if you just look to nature, for example, if you have cats, cats can be very relaxed, but then when they're threatened or when they need to move very quickly, they can move, with like a flash of lightning. But
mhm,
that comes from their relaxation. It does not come from being rigid. And
mm,
so oftentimes when people are being very, very rigid, they're not able to move very quickly into, different modes of being or different ways to achieve success. I'll throw it back to you again.
incredible. Incredible. I don't know. You have a very, very unique level of zen in the way you
Mm,
just relay information and it resonates in a very, very, very subtle but powerful way. So
mm,
thank you for sharing the wisdom that you had. And I guess coming back to incense, I do love incense myself.
mm,
I do understand that you do get artificial stuff that comes with chemicals. But I was going to ask, in terms of a particular incense that you've used or come across in your lifetime, is there one that stood out to you in particular in terms of its effect on the body? From the top of my mind, there are three that I'll mention or list.
mm,
One is Palo Santo. It's
mhm.
a very, very potent, pungent smelling wood, but when you burn it, it really, I don't want to say hits the spot, but it gets you to a deep state. The
Uh-huh.
other is frankincense. I can't
Uh-huh.
explain how that one is, but also very, very, very good. And then just if you, yes, there we go. Have you seen the dragon's blood, the resin?
Oh yeah.
It's a very I used to do workouts with my friends in the garage and would burn that and would have some pretty intense workouts. So I don't
No,
know
I
if
love
there's any instance that's stuck out to you. I still love it. I still do it, and not as much though. But I do it for my own personal space from time to time when I want to clear the space more than anything so that I can finally figure out what's going on internally. So I hand it over to you.
Yeah. Well, you picked three great incenses, and by the way, if you're watching this, folks, we did not, pre-design what we're going to talk about. So I love that you talked about those three. So the best dragon's blood is coming from Socotra, and that is a wonderful fragrance. That it's a red resin. It can look like
Mm,
red rock depending on how they break it down. But when you warm it or when you heat it, it starts to bubble like blood.
mm,
That's the reason why that you get the name dragon's blood, because it was coming from these really, exotic places
mm,
when people were first encountering it. But it's been used for thousands of years to clear the space. It's used in a whole myriad of things, but especially the magical community
Mm,
in Europe during the medieval period and even sooner than that. When you talk about frankincense, there's 19 different varieties of frankincense. There's a couple in contention.
mm,
But what's so fascinating about frankincense is that if you take the terpene profile of
mm,
dragon's blood, of Palo Santo, and of frankincense, you're going to see similar terpenes across that. If you don't know what terpenes are, terpenes control the taste, the color, and fragrance of everything in our natural world. And so, with the advent or with the legalization of marijuana in some states, this conversation around terpenes has been very helpful because the terpenes are actually what is the healing and beneficial aspect of
mm,
cannabis.
mm,
I have numerous papers in my collection of showing how cannabis and frankincense were burned together in some of the oldest temples in the world. And so the way from a molecular standpoint, how the two molecules or all the molecules that are in frankincense and then in cannabis, how they interact with each other creates a very interesting experience. I'm not advocating for cannabis.
mm,
I'm giving you the history because again, before our laws, if something was beneficial and you discovered it, in nature thousands of years ago, well, you're going to start to use that. And
mm,
so there's a lot of history with a lot of the things we're talking about that either is incorrect or has been altered or changed based on the particular times that people were living in. But the three that you've chosen, and let's talk a little bit about Palo Santo before we go a little deeper. Palo Santo's from South America, it was used a lot in Catholicism, along with the other incenses that you would associate with Catholicism, like frankincense and myrrh and things like
mm,
that. But the three that you've chosen are fantastic. What I also love about why you've chosen those is that they're 100% natural.
mm,
And that's really what the secret is that I can go right now to a head shop or a truck stop and I can buy incenses like money
no,
and
no, those ones. Oh, we all hate those.
joy and sex, right? No, please do not burn those. I once had somebody talk to me and they're like, John, I want to show you a really powerful incense. I'm like, oh, really? That'd be great. And then he produced this bright a neon colored orange stick. And I was like, how is that powerful? And he was like, oh, it's been blessed by a monk. And I'm like, okay, but it's neon orange. I mean, there may be neon colors in nature, right? But that is not a natural color. What is it made out of? Oh, I don't know, but it's been blessed by a monk, therefore it's better. No, not at all. Not at all. So the point that I'm making is this, just like we are selective about the type of foods that we put into our body or not, depending on who you are, we want to be very selective of what we are putting into our bodies. And so, in all of the incense companies that exist in the world, there's only a handful that I
Mm,
fully recommend and promote. I don't sell incense anymore, except for some of the high grade
mm,
um, uh, combinations that I make or things that you just can't find on the internet. I will help people do that. But if anyone reaches out to me, I'm more than happy to share my vendors. And if you mention my name and you mention Shihan Wellness, they'll put little samples, in your bag. And these are people that I've ordered from for over 30 years. And so when you the important part of this is or the important part of this piece of the conversation right now is understanding that the quality of our mind creates the quality of our experience in all of reality. And
mm,
so if we're putting fake and synthetic things into our bodies for, physical nourishment like our food, or we're putting things into our body that are synthetic for our mind, well, what is that really creating? And so when you go back and you look at any of the world religion, great books, I'm talking about, the Quran, the Bible, any of the ancient texts that we could move down. At some point in time, there's the reference to fragrance and there's
mm,
reference to the beautiful fragrance or quotes like a pleasing fragrance unto the Lord.
mm,
Well, One of the things that I like is there's some quotes from India when you talk about incense, where, you know, when you are able to produce the quality of no mind, and what I mean by no mind is not that you're unconscious or passed out. It's that when you're able to be with another human being and you have no other thoughts going in your head, like, oh, I've got to go do laundry, or I got to go
Mm,
do that email, or I got, and you're really present in the moment, you really begin to create an incredible connection. But
mm,
nowadays, with people's phones and they're all what they're doing,
mm,
it gets in the way of our connection. And so the quality again of the food, the quality of your water, the quality of the fragrances that you put into your mind and body creates a unification. And so nowadays it just gets harder and harder to do that because we don't know what's in our water and we don't necessarily know what's in our food. And I'm not preaching. I'm just
mm,
basically saying that it's like if you're looking holistically at what you're putting into your body, and I'm even talking about the kind of news that you watch or the way that people communicate with you. These are the things that I'm bringing to both the corporate space and the wellness space that allow us to. I mean, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm going to basically ask, I'm going to say, I'm going to say, Mufaro, what is it that you're committed to? And you might tell me what those things are. And then you and I could then begin to work together. So if we're looking at the full totality of the things that I'm offering, is that yesterday, for example, I gave a sold out speech and experience called the Incense Journey, and I do those publicly all over the world. And they're usually anywhere between 25 to 50 people, in a space, having different experiences with fragrances that they may not even know about. If I look off here to my left, I'm looking at my incense collection. My incense collection numbers close to 700 different types of fragrances. And like, how do you go through 700 fragrances? Well, you really don't, right? But if I'm working with somebody and they say, oh, hey, John, I have a high level of PTSD. And I'm like, okay, well, where did you grow up? What was your childhood like? They might tell me, oh, well, I grew up in a rural area. I did a lot of hunting as a kid. I said, oh, well, did you enjoy hunting? I did. I felt really in tune with nature. So that begins to tell me what types of fragrances that I might reintroduce to this person so that they can return back to a state of feeling
yes.
at one with nature. And so the work that I do with executives, the works that I do with former military personnel, I work with a charity called the Special Operations Charity Network, and I will work with veterans of wars to really look at their high level of PTSD and how do I have them re-experience some emotional things from a separating standpoint so that the PTSD begins to drop. But some people think that PTSD is only for people that have been in the military or have had very, very traumatic experiences, when in actuality, all of us, all of us have PTSD and anxiety to a certain level with certain things. And it's any time in life where you emotionally couldn't deal with something
Mm,
and then you had to compensate. Well, that compensation creates a memory, it creates an imprint. It also can create some kind of a limiting aspect of your mind. And so if I'm working with an executive who, his last business failed, well, we might want to look at, okay, how do we get rid of or lower the impact of that negative memory so that you're able to then powerfully jump back into the game and create success. So again, I'll throw it back to you.
incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's incredible how you've brought two worlds together. I think for the most part, at least in my social environment here, incense is always seen as one of those outside overly spiritual things. People think, oh, these people are trying to, but when you really study and actually immerse yourself in the practice of, even if you just go to a smudging ceremony and you have a prayer ceremony where the incense invokes, it literally heightens you from the physical plane, almost to a
Mhm.
plane that you didn't know existed. So thank you for giving insight into just how practical it is in helping people, not just overcoming emotional blockages, but perhaps things that are much deeper than we know. So I was going to ask you maybe a bit non-related to the instance, but it was about your books. I know you're in the process of releasing a book coming out this year, but the book that you have released, the life and times of Mr. Charles, I didn't write it properly here. I can't see it, Mr. Charles. I can't see the P.
Parsons.
Parsons. There you
Yeah.
go.
Yeah.
I was wondering, what about military history stands out to you? Is there a specific reason why you love to tell stories through the lens of war? Is there a specific reason to that? And is there something that we can draw from war itself in terms of helping us understand ourselves as individuals and perhaps even helping us in our healing journey? Not just the
Great question.
violence and the negative aspects that we see, but perhaps, as you said, a zen within the storm that perhaps people can draw insight from.
Yeah, I love that. So I jumped off camera for a second, turned around because I grabbed a copy of the book, right?
Yes.
So the life and times of Missouri's Charles Parsons between art and war. What you're seeing there at the bottom, that building, that's the first art museum west of the Mississippi. So a little bit about Charles Parsons. Charles Parsons was born in 1824 in Cortland County, New York, and then started traveling west. Obviously, during that time, they were settling the West. And what I mean by settling is that they were creating mass genocide and basically claiming the entire, continent of North America for the U.S. government, essentially. Well, Charles Parsons was an individual who was deeply connected to the divine. I mean, he was a very devout religious man.
Mhm.
But as he started traveling across the United States, he ends up getting to St. Louis, and then didn't like it when he first gets here in 1857, and goes north up to Keokuk, Iowa, to open a bank. Well, Keokuk, Iowa was on its way to becoming the next Chicago when a little thing called the Civil War breaks out. And so what happens was that Charles Parsons' brother Lewis becomes a general in the Union Army of the Civil War, and basically is responsible for river and rail transportation. So he asked his brother Charles to come back from Keokuk, come to St. Louis, and work with him to become a quartermaster and move the supplies of men and animals and ammunition and everything else during the war. Well, why is that important? Well, sometimes in life, there are conflicts that take place that are beyond us, that we have no ability necessarily to stop. The only thing we can do is to move along with it because it's much larger than ourselves.
Mhm.
And so what I think is interesting about Charles Parsons and his life is that Charles Parsons, though he becomes a brevet lieutenant colonel in the Union Army during the war, he starts to see ways that we could refine how the US government does contracting with different vendors. Now, that may not seem like, anything spiritual or apropos, but the way that business was brought to the military changed a lot of the ways that the military does work, and that's still influenced today. But for Charles Parsons specifically, he saw that by bringing different types of solutions to society, that after the war and as people were starting to heal, he could actually bring different solutions to society at large. And what I mean by that is education, religion. At that time, religion was much more important, I think, than it is today from a society standpoint.
Mhm.
But Charles Parsons used business, and he used banking, and he used his faith to make some great contributions. So one of the first things that he did was that he was one of the early founders of Washington University in St. Louis, and specifically, he was instrumental in creating the first art museum west of the Mississippi. He and about seven other individuals. But he saw that through art we could transform ourselves, and we could be inspired by the divine. Before the 19th century, art was considered a little decadent, and it was only reserved primarily for religious spaces.
Mhm.
But in the 19th century, we begin to see the appreciation of art go from just inside the house, or just inside the church, to then inside the house, to then eventually into institutions called art museums and things like that. And so Charles Parsons wanted to make sure that education was available to all people. He wanted to make sure that museums, or at least the museums in St. Louis that he was a part of, would be free. for
Mm.
all people. And so if you come to St. Louis and you go to any of our cultural institutions, most of them are free. And if you go to other places in the world, you're like, wait, I have to pay to go into a museum. It's shocking to some people. But Charles Parsons was really interested in using religion and art to transform society. And so he also started Parsons College in Fairfield, Iowa in 1875. That museum, sorry, that school would exist for about 100 years. And then in the 1970s, there was a guy by the name of Maharishi Mahesh who buys the
Mm.
college and turns it into the Maharsh or the Maharishi University. And that now is the world headquarters of Transcendental Meditation.
Wow.
And so, yeah, so there's all these connections in the book to a whole bunch of different areas and places. Also, what's interesting about today, Charles Parsons and his wife supported a female sculptor who would become one of the first to achieve international acclaim. In the 19th century, the idea of a female sculptor was pretty much unheard of. Now, there were a
Mm.
couple, but her work is amazing. Also, though we would not use the term in the 19th century, she identified as a lesbian in
Mm.
the 19th century, though again we would not use that, but it was well known, and so it was supported. And so
Mm.
this idea of being open and
Mm.
this idea of supporting people in their own journey and path, as much as Charles Parsons could do that in the 19th century, he brought that. So that he was fascinating to me for a number of different levels, but not initially for him. So initially in 2006, when I got to Washington University in St. Louis after almost 6 years with another profession that I had, I got into the museum. And after the museum had opened and things had kind of calmed down a little bit, the director of the museum wanted to see the 19th century collection. And so we started pulling out Charles Parsons's art that he had bequeathed to Washington University in St. Louis, originally in 1905 when he passed
Wow.
away, but really not until 1922 when his nephew dies, because basically the collection was promised to him, but after his death, then it would go to the university. And so you're seeing pieces of art in the 19th century from Corot, from Church, from Gifford and Innes, which is great from an art history standpoint. But what I was really interested in was the fact that Charles Parsons had collected a great deal of accoutrement of Japanese and Chinese
Wow.
incense collections. And so when we started looking at these things, I walked over to one particular item, and it was a Tokugawa incense burner that was labeled incorrectly as a bowl. And so I turned to the director and I said, "That's not a bowl." And she said, "What is it?" I said, "That's a Tokugawa incense burner." And so I started talking about the iconography on the burner itself.
Mm.
And she was like, huh. She was write an essay. And so I wrote an essay. Well, there were a whole number of other items within the collection here. I'll grab the book again and I'll get a couple of photos as we're talking. Um, but so much of the collection was incorrect. For example, this right here. So this is a depiction of what I am in the Japanese tradition. I'll get it right there. There you go. So
I
that's
see.
that's a Komoto with his student, with his kohai. And
Uh,
so that was labeled as unknown. And so that was another essay that I wrote that distinguished what those things are. But it was fascinating to me, like, who is this Charles Parsons and why is he collecting so many different things that I know about, that sure other people know about them in the world, but why is that showing up in my world? So that's the Tokugawa incense burner
beautiful.
that yeah, that was labeled as a bowl, not a bowl. And so, what I was able to do was, in creating these essays about the objects, what it started to point to was who was Charles Parsons. And what I would discover was that Charles Parsons was an individual who, though dealt with great strife and great issue, especially through war, he
Mm.
trans he transmuted his experience in war to make society better. So if we circle back to your original question about what can we learn about war, as unfortunate as war is, war does upgrade society from time to time. So if we and when I first say that, people kind of look at me quizzically. But if we look at the samurai culture, they warred for essentially 1,000 years.
Mm.
And in that 1,000 years of samurai culture, they would develop, really interesting weapons. They would develop really interesting techniques and processes for society that sure would favor those in power, but also make the entire society work. If you look at the difference, or if you look at the societal difference between before World War One and
Mhm.
after World War One, or then let's just look at World War Two. So World War Two, before World War Two, we obviously didn't have the A bomb. We didn't have the atomic bomb.
Mhm.
Well, after World War Two, well, society has changed.
Mhm.
So one of the good things of war is that it upgrades society with technology and things like that. And I would like to see a world without war, but in our conflict is where we create resolution. And if
Mhm.
you if you look at your entire life, we have many wars within ourselves, or we have many wars within our communities that then we get to hopefully a place of resolution. And so again, I'm not advocating for war. I'm not saying that, but there are benefits. Just like in the same, this will sound maybe a little odd, but if somebody's a hoarder,
Mhm.
you might say that their house is nothing but chaos and war. But in order to get in there and to start that conflict, if you like my father was a hoarder before his death. And
Mhm.
so when I was working with him to clean out his house, it would sometimes get, contentious about why do
Mhm.
you need this? I want it, I need it, I want it. And so I hope you can see in the at least in the metaphors and analogies is that when we have conflict, the conflict is an opportunity to reconcile. And
Mhm.
so I think that there is value and benefit in learning from what goes on in war. Um, and I think it's important because it's been with human beings since the beginning, unfortunately. Um, did that help?
No, it did. It did. I was just a side question. Have you read the Book of Five Rings?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, Go no Rosho by
yes,
Miyamoto Musashi. Oh yeah,
incredible.
yeah, yeah.
Interesting take on how he viewed conflict, combat, and his divine purpose in life. So I just asked that question, but no, thank you. You did answer the question, and it was very, very. I did not know these unsung heroes in history that we really don't know about. So
Yeah,
we
well,
agree.
well, I love that you brought up, the Book of Five Rings, because if you read the Book of Five Rings and then you read Stephen Mitchell's translation of the Tao Te Ching,
Hmm.
what's really interesting is that those two books complement each other and really illustrate exactly what I was just saying about how though war is unfortunate, it can actually be something that can be used as a force of good following the conflict. And
Mm.
so if the Musashi's book, The Book of Five Rings, is really about, teaching about the strategy and the
Yep,
mindset,
said
you
yes.
know, of war. Well, the Tao Te Ching is really a treatise on the art of government, whether of a country or of a child. And so understanding these books that have survived, you know, um, our changes in society, we oftentimes call them the wisdom books, right?
Mhm.
It's like if you spend your time reading the wisdom books over any other fad book that might come out, you're going to find yourself in a much better place because there's a reason why that these wisdom books have survived.
And it's transcendental. It's the knowledge
Absolutely.
that transcends time and space.
Mhm.
So no, thank you so much. I know obviously you have your obligations that you need to attend to as well. So I don't want to take too much of your time. I guess I have two more questions. One is how can people reach out to you, and do you work with people virtually if it's outside of the US? Is
Mhm.
there any contact details in case people may want to learn more about Shihan Consultants, and as well as any programs that you offer that they may want to participate in, specifically businesses? I know, I guess now mental health and well-being is now a very fundamental part of corporate practice in today's world, thankfully.
Mhm.
And so that was the first question, and then the last question are, what are your words and wisdom or advice for the audience tuning in today?
Got it. So what I would say first is that the easiest way to get a hold of me is just to go to one of the websites. So if you go to Shihan Wellness, Shihan, just like you can see on the screen, Shihan wellness.com. If you go to contact us, those emails go directly to me and my staff. And so that is the easiest way to get a hold of me. So Shihan Wellness, you'll learn about the work I do with hypnosis. When you talk about working with people around the world, I do hypnosis in person or I do it virtually, and I work with people all around the world. And so, if anyone is dealing with any kind of mental challenge, everything from quitting smoking to stage fright, or wants more motivation, wants to reprogram their mind to be as effective as possible, then yes, I will absolutely do that. And that's ShihanWellness.com. Shihan Consultants, which you're seeing on the screen, Shihan hyphen consultants. So Shihan hyphen consultants, there you'll learn about all the corporate offerings that I'm doing. And again, the contact us goes directly to me and my team, and more than happy to follow up. And I think that's the easiest without going, too much deeper there.
Nice.
Um, yeah, but it's one of those things where when you talk about wellness programs inside the workplace, we spend most of our waking life at work.
Mhm.
Whether you are a sole entrepreneur or whether you are working for a company, we spend most of our waking life at work, and so it better be valuable.
Yeah.
So the kinds of programs that we've been bringing to people really expands out the culture so that you create a business with some of the most high performing individuals that are there. And it's not like, oh, we're making you be high performance. No, it's like when the company does well, we do well. And if you've made the choice to be a part of a company, then how can you all learn to row in the same direction pretty powerfully?
Mhm.
Culture is the shadow of leadership.
Mhm.
And so when you look at the culture of a company, just look to the leadership, because that shadow is being cast in a particular way. And so the culture is that amalgamative conversations that are going on within a company. So the company forward, which instead of a retreat, the company forward that I offer through Shihan Consultants is really a high speed experience of being able, what are the most important conversations that we need to have as a company, and we'll do these every 90 days. So, and what people get is they get a 2 hour discovery session.
Mhm.
Out of that discovery session, they get a mini report that kind of recaps that. Then once that's approved, then they get a 4 hour experience with me and another co-facilitator that I bring in. And we have the most important kinds of conversations that we need to have. And then from there, they get a final report. Companies can engage me and my team for further follow-up, but it is a very powerful experience. And I've worked with some very big companies creating some wonderful results, and also small companies as well.
Mhm.
So, long story short, is that again, Shihan Wellness and Shihan Consultants is about this external and internal journey that we all have. And so, since everything is customized, the easiest way to start to create something that would really have you develop and achieve the kind of goals that you want is just to reach out, either shihanwellness.com or shihan-consultants.com. And I'm more than happy to chat.
Thank you. And I'll make sure to add the link in the description and in the bottom right-hand corner for the video so that people can access you. And again, for those of you that are tuning in, it's always good to look into alternative means to handling some of the stressful situations that we're finding in corporate and personal lives, particularly with the state of the economy and the state of the world. Things are not that easy. So this is a good avenue to look into. After all, your internal well-being is paramount in times like these. So thank you for sharing those details.
You're welcome. And I'll leave you with two things. One is that if you want to travel to the Midwest, you have two opportunities. September 13th through the 15th, I'm going to be a part of something called the Integration Weekend, which is going to be in the outskirts of St. Louis for 3 days. It's a whole bunch of different healing modalities, as you were just talking about, Mufaro. And then in St. Louis on September 28th, I'm going to be doing an entire full day certification on fragrance and hypnosis, and really, looking at your personal and professional mastery on a number of things. I'm going to bring in one of my co-facilitators, one of my co-creators of a program. Her name is Sandra Grace. She is a fantastic presenter. She runs a company called Integrated LifeWorks Inc., and she'll be my partner in St. Louis, September 28th for an entire day certification. So if that's interesting to you as well, reach out. We'll chat about that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And lastly was, yes, your words of wisdom and advice for those tuning in today.
Words of wisdom. What comes to me is a quote from the Tao Te Ching that says, "He who knows doesn't talk. He who talks doesn't know." So what does that mean? Well, this is almost a 3,000-year-old quote. And the idea here is that if somebody just talks to talk, do they really know?
Mm.
But if they don't talk and somebody asks a question, true teaching only happens when you ask. You can go find value and benefit from going to a lecture, but unless you ask a question, that part of your brain isn't fully open. And so the idea is that if you really want to know another human being, ask them the question. If you really want to know about, your business or whatever you're working, ask the question. And so we have gotten away from this practice of asking questions of those who've gone before us. And so he who knows doesn't talk. He who talks doesn't know. But yet he says that. And where's the question?
Wow. No, potent words of wisdom, definitely. And again, just thank you so much for giving your time to come onto the podcast, John. It's been an absolute pleasure. You have definitely the essence of a master who has never ceased to learn, which is a good thing. I think that's a very, 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 that's what really emulates from you is you are a seeker at heart. And so, yes, I'll make sure all your socials are available for people to access you and your content, and obviously wishing you the very best with your business as you expand, as you move forward, and as you draw incense therapy to many more people around the world. That's the beauty about these podcasts, is the reach that you have and the exposure that you have to. I'm in South Africa, so who knows how many people here you impact and touch with what you're doing. So I just want to thank you again for coming on.
Awesome. Mufar, thank you so much. You have a great day. Thank you.